He was 69 years old, sitting at dinner with his wife and two close friends when the knock came. Not a frantic knock, a quiet, official knock, the kind that carries its own sentence before anyone opens the door. The year was 65 AD, and a soldier was standing on the other side. The soldier carried a message from Emperor Nero. Seneca, philosopher, playwright, the man who had tutored Nero as a child and guided the early years of his reign, was ordered to take his own life. He had, by most accounts, less than 2 hours to do it. What happened next, recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus in the Annals, Book 15, is one of the most detailed and unsettling accounts of a man choosing how to die. And buried inside that account is something that has almost nothing to do with death, and everything to do with how you handle the moment when the outcome is already decided. Stay with this story, because in about 7 minutes we're going to get to a specific technique Seneca used in that room. A technique so counterintuitive that most people under pressure do the exact opposite. And it works whether you're in a Roman villa in 65 AD or sitting in a doctor's office in 2026. To understand why Seneca's death matters, you have to understand what his life was. He was not a remote philosopher writing abstract theory in a quiet study. He was one of the most powerful men in Rome, wealthy beyond imagination, politically entangled, constantly compromised, constantly aware of his own contradictions. He had been exiled once, under Emperor Claudius, to the island of Corsica for 8 years, accused of adultery with the emperor's niece, a charge almost certainly political. He wrote from exile not with bitterness, but with a kind of grim self-examination that would define his entire body of work. When Claudius died and the teenage Nero came to power in 54 AD, Seneca was recalled to Rome and appointed as one of the boy emperor's primary tutors and advisors. For the next 8 years, many historians argue, Seneca was effectively co-running the Roman Empire alongside the military commander Burrus. He knew Nero's cruelty was growing. He watched as Nero had his own mother Agrippina assassinated in 59 AD. A murder Seneca helped cover up by writing the official letter to the Roman Senate explaining the death. He was not a saint. He was a man living inside a system that could kill him, trying to do enough good to justify the compromises. By 62 AD, sensing the ground shifting, Seneca tried to retire. He went to Nero and offered to return everything, his wealth, his influence, his estates. According to Tacitus, Nero embraced him, told him he was irreplaceable, and let him go home. But he did not let him go, not really. 3 years later, in 65 AD, a group of senators and military officers hatched a conspiracy to assassinate Nero, the so-called Pisonian conspiracy. It failed. One of the conspirators broke under interrogation and named names. Seneca's name appeared. Whether he was actually involved remains disputed by historians to this day. Nero needed no certainty. He sent a tribune named Gavius Silvanus to Seneca's villa outside Rome, where Seneca was dining with his wife Pompeia Paulina and 2 friends. The tribune's job was simple: deliver the verdict, confirm there was no escape, and wait. Tacitus records that Seneca listened to the message without visible emotion. He asked the tribune whether Nero would allow him a voluntary death. Suicide was the Roman aristocrat's version of a dignified exit, sparing the family from further punishment. The tribune said nothing definitive and went to confirm the order. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect. Because what Seneca did in the next few minutes, while a soldier waited in his house and his wife was weeping and his friends were frozen in shock, was not what most of us imagine a condemned man doing. And this is the moment we need to slow down and look at carefully. According to Tacitus, Seneca turned to his friends, who were overcome with grief, and told them, directly, without softening it, that this moment was exactly what philosophy had been preparing him for, not as a comfort, not as a performance, as a statement of operational fact. He said, in effect, where are the precepts of philosophy now? Where is the reason we studied for all these years? We knew Nero's cruelty. We prepared for this. This moment was always coming in some form, and here it is. Tacitus paraphrases the speech, but the core is intact. Seneca reframed the moment not as a catastrophe, but as a test he had been studying for his entire life. Then he turned to his wife. Pompeia Paulina announced that she would die with him. she would open her veins alongside her husband. Tacitus records that Seneca initially resisted. He praised her courage, acknowledged her love, but told her that showing endurance of life was not easier than showing endurance of death. He was trying to save her. She refused to be saved. And so Seneca accepted her choice with what Tacitus describes as genuine admiration. He did not waste the moment arguing. He moved forward. He called for the instruments, the blades, and opened the veins in both arms. Paulina did the same. But Seneca's blood ran slowly. He was old, his body weakened by decades of illness. He had struggled with asthma and respiratory problems for most of his adult life, describing it vividly in his letters, particularly Epistle 54, where he calls an asthma attack a rehearsal for death. The physical reality of his dying was slow and difficult. He then cut the veins behind his knees. Still, death did not come quickly. In the meantime, and this is the detail that Tacitus records almost as if he himself cannot believe it, Seneca continued talking. He was dictating to his secretaries. He was composing words that he intended for a wider audience. Tacitus does not give us the exact text of what Seneca dictated in those final minutes, and later historians note that those writings were in wide circulation at the time Tacitus was writing, so he assumed his readers already knew them. What he does tell us is that Seneca's focus was outward, on transmission, on what could be left behind, not on what was being taken. When his body still refused to die from blood loss, Seneca asked his friend and physician Statius Aeneas for the cup of hemlock, the same poison that had killed Socrates in Athens nearly 5 centuries earlier. He drank it. It also failed. His body, weakened and in shock, could not absorb the poison efficiently. Finally, his attendants carried him into a warm bath. The heat was meant to speed the blood loss. Tacitus records that as he was lowered into the water, Seneca sprinkled some of the water toward the slaves and attendants nearby, and said that he offered this as a libation to Jupiter the Liberator. It was a ritual gesture, a thank you to the god of freedom, offered with the last physical act he was capable of making deliberate. He died from the steam and the heat, suffocating, in the bath. He was approximately 69 years old. The year was 65 AD. His wife Paulina survived. Nero, apparently not wanting the additional political problem of a philosopher martyr's widow, ordered her wounds bound before she bled out. She lived for several more years, but, Tacitus notes, her face remained permanently pale. Tacitus closes the account with a restraint that itself feels like a judgment. He notes that Seneca's will, originally full of compliments to Nero, had been changed in the final years when Seneca saw which way things were going. He died without the grand testament he had once planned. He died with his words and his composure. Now, before we cross into what this means for your life today, there is one more thing inside Seneca's own letters that reframes everything you just heard. Because Seneca did not start preparing for this moment in that dining room. He had been preparing for it, specifically and deliberately, for decades, and the method he used is written down in plain language in letters you can still read today. In Epistle 26, written years before his death, Seneca describes what he calls a practice of meditating on the end, not morbidly, not dramatically, but as a regular accounting, a daily habit of asking, if this were my last day, what is the quality of my mind right now? He called this going to meet death. He meant it as a cognitive exercise, not a ritual. And in Epistle 77, he writes something that sounds almost cold until you sit with it. There is nothing good or bad, he says, save in the will. The situation itself, exile, illness, the emperor's verdict, none of it is the real event. The real event is always what happens inside the person receiving the news. That is where the actual life is taking place. This is the rehook I promised you at the start, because what Seneca demonstrates in that dining room in 65 AD is not superhuman calm. It is the result of a specific, repeatable practice, one that anyone can do and almost no one does, because it requires you to think about the thing you most want to avoid thinking about. But what does this mean for you, watching this in 2026? You are almost certainly not waiting for a Roman soldier to knock on your door. But you may have received a phone call you didn't expect. You may be sitting with a diagnosis that arrived like a verdict. You may have been told your position is being eliminated, that the relationship is over, that the thing you built is gone. And in that moment, the moment after the news arrives, but before you've fully processed it, most people do one of two things. They either go completely numb and functional, pushing through as if nothing happened, or they spiral, running the same unbearable thought in loops, trying somehow to change an outcome that is already fixed. Seneca, in that dining room, did neither. And the reason he was capable of that is not because he was a philosopher. It's because of a specific distinction he had trained himself to make, one that the Stoics called the dichotomy of control, and that Epictetus, Seneca's contemporary, described even more bluntly. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. The verdict was not up to Seneca. Nero's decision was not up to Seneca. The speed at which his blood ran was not up to Seneca. What was up to him? The quality of his attention in those final hours. What he said to his friends, what he composed, how he spoke to his wife, how he treated the servants who carried him into the bath. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Most of us, when we face genuinely bad news, spend enormous amounts of energy on the column of things that are not up to us, because that is where the pain is. The diagnosis is in that column. The decision your company made is in that column. The other person's choice is in that column. And we pour ourselves into it because it feels like if we just think hard enough, we can somehow change what's already decided. Here is the first concrete modern situation. Imagine you've just been told you're being laid off. The decision is made. There is no appeal. You have 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, most people oscillate between rage at the unfairness and a kind of paralyzed anxiety about the future. Both of those are real. Neither of them is in your control column. What is in your control column? Who you call in the next 48 hours. What you build or document before you leave. How you treat the people who work alongside you. What story you tell about this event, not publicly, but to yourself. Seneca dictated words in his final hour, not because they would save him, but because creation was in his control column, and he refused to leave it empty. Here is the second concrete modern situation. A medical diagnosis. Something serious enough that the word management has replaced the word cure in your conversations with doctors. The condition itself is not in your control column. The timeline is mostly not in your control column. What is? Your sleep, your relationships, what you read, what you say to the people you love, what you decide this period of your life is going to be about. Seneca knew he had asthma for decades. He described it in Epistle 54 as coming on without warning, lasting a short time, departing like a storm. He says the doctors called it meditating on death. He says he preferred to call it meditating on life, because every time he came back from it, he was reminded that the present moment was the one thing no one could take from him while he was in it. This brings us to the actionable technique. It is called, in modern psychological language, the pre-mortem. But Seneca's version is older and, I would argue, more honest. It goes like this. You take a specific feared outcome, the layoff, the diagnosis, the ending of something, and you write about it as if it has already happened. Not to catastrophize, not to torture yourself, but to rehearse the way Seneca rehearsed, so that when the actual moment comes, it is not the first time your mind has been in that room. You've already walked around in it. You've already found the things in your control column. You've already, in some sense, survived it on paper. Research in cognitive psychology, particularly work on emotional anticipation and expressive writing, developed by James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, shows that people who write about feared future events in advance show measurably lower anxiety responses when those events occur. Seneca didn't have Pennebaker's data. He had 40 years of practice. The mechanism is the same. The key distinction is this. You are not writing about the feared outcome to make peace with it emotionally right away. That may not happen. You are writing to locate, concretely and specifically, the column of things that remain in your control even inside that worst-case scenario, because that column is always there. Even in a Roman bathtub in 65 AD, there was a control column. There is one more thing inside Seneca's final hours that is worth naming, because Tacitus records it, and most summaries of this story leave it out. After Seneca and Paulina had both opened their veins, Seneca asked that his wife be taken to a separate room. He did this because, Tacitus writes, he saw that she was suffering partly because of witnessing him suffer, and he wanted to remove that from her experience. Even at the edge of his own death, his attention was on what he could still do for someone else. This is the Stoic principle of sympathia, the idea that we are not isolated units managing our own internal weather. We are connected, and even in the worst moment, what we do with that connection is a choice. Seneca chose, in his last hour, to use his remaining attention on the quality of someone else's experience. That is not detachment. That is the opposite of detachment. So here is the reflection prompt, the question I want you to sit with, ideally in writing, sometime in the next 24 hours. Not when the crisis comes. Now, while you're still in a position of relative stability and choice, the question is this: what is the thing you are most afraid of being told? And inside that scenario, as specifically as you can imagine it, what remains in your control column? Write the feared scenario as if it has already happened. Use past tense. I was told. It ended. The company let me go. Then write in the same entry every single thing that was still yours to decide inside that scenario. You will find more than you expect. That list is your actual life. Everything else is weather. Seneca spent 13 years with the man who would order his death. He advised him, defended him, wrote speeches for him, and watched him grow into something monstrous. He knew for years that the verdict was probably coming, and when it came, he was not finished by it. He used the hour. Tacitus, who was not writing hagiography, who was often skeptical of Seneca's wealth and political compromises, still records the death with a kind of reluctant awe. He notes that Seneca remained in character, that the philosopher died the way the philosopher lived, that the preparation was visible in the performance. In Seneca's own Epistle 61, written years before his death, he says, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day." He meant this literally, a daily accounting, not a dramatic ritual. A quiet question before bed. Did I use today? Did I choose today? Or did I just pass through it? The bathtub in the villa outside Rome in 65 AD is not a symbol of defeat. Inside Tacitus's account, it is actually the opposite. It is the place where a man who had spent a lifetime writing about how to die demonstrated that he had meant every word. Not perfectly. The blood ran slowly, the hemlock failed, the steam had to finish what the blades could not. But with his attention intact, with his voice still working, with his wife's well-being still on his mind, you will face a moment, if you haven't already, where the outcome is decided before you walk into the room. Where the news is already news before it's delivered. And you will have a choice in that moment that has nothing to do with the outcome and everything to do with who you are inside it. Seneca spent decades practicing for that choice. The practice is available to you right now. If this video reached you, if Seneca's story landed in a way that felt useful rather than just interesting, share it with one person who is currently navigating something they cannot change. Not as advice, just as company. Because the hardest part of facing an inevitable outcome is usually the belief that no one has ever faced it with this much to lose. Seneca faced it with everything to lose, and he used the hour